Good morning, David.
Hi, Anthony.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of our Espresso Briefs. I'd like to introduce our guest on Espresso Briefs this morning, David Lewis. Um, David and I have come a long way over the years. David, as many of you may know, was the initial chairman of the Competition Tribunal, which he served with distinction for many, many years. He then went on to become, I think, the chairman or deputy chairman of the International Competition Network. He was also the founding executive director of Corruption Watch, and most recently has been a member of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council to the President. Um, one of David's one of my favorite achievements of David's was a book that he wrote called Thieves at the Dinner Table, enforcing the Competition Act. And David, it's a great pleasure to have you this morning, and thank you very, very much for your time this morning. And this morning we want to explore a very topical issue with you, and that's in relation to the NPA, the South African Police Services, and our justice system more generally. And I think you've had the benefit of looking at the criminal justice system from many vantage points throughout your career in the different capacities that you've occupied. And we wanted to explore a couple of themes with you this morning, and maybe I can just discuss some of those themes. And my colleague Michelle Rawlinson, who has been instrumental in our white-collar crime practice, is also going to engage in a couple of these topics with you. But just to run through some of the issues, the first is the institutional and financial independence of the NPA. And that is really, to our mind, a really critical issue as matters currently stand. And linked to that is really the powers of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. I think most people assume that the person who occupies that position has kind of got carte blanche to run the organization as they deem fit and as they think is most efficient. But what most people don't realize is how constrained the NDPP actually is and the limitations of the exercise of his or her powers. And we'd really like to discuss that issue with you. Secondly, are we appointing the right people to head up the NPA? Shamila Batoy has recently come in for a lot of criticism. Some of it, I think, is quite unfounded. But nevertheless, in some quarters, there's been a lot of criticism about her leadership. And Andy Matibi has recently been appointed by the president to take over the NDPP function. But Andy is 63 and the mandatory retirement age is 65, so he's only really got 2 years to go. And is he really going to be able to make a meaningful difference to the organization in that period of time? And then we want to talk a little bit about the track record of the NPA with prosecutions. Again, there's been a lot of criticism of the organization about the lack of high-profile, successful prosecutions. Is that a function of a skills deficit? Is that a function of institutional dysfunction? What are the issues there? So those are some of the things that we would like to explore with you on the discussion this morning. Can we start off about what keeps you up at night when you think about our criminal justice system? You've obviously been involved in the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council report that was, I think, released to the president at the end of last year. You've got some very, very good insights into our criminal justice system. What's worrying you, and what do you think are some of the fixes?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Michelle, and thanks for inviting me to this. It's good to be involved in this. Uh, yeah, there are a lot of reasons to be worried about the criminal justice system, and I don't doubt that there are people thank goodness there are people in the criminal justice system would share this. But the major problem is SAPS, is the South African Police Services. Although I'm sure today we'll spend more time talking about the NPA and the Hawks, because and IDAC, the unit within the NPA that is responsible for investigating and prosecuting serious corruption. And SAPS would seem to be at some distance from this, but it underlies the entire criminal justice system. And how one is going to turn around that body, I don't know. We have some ideas, and some of these ideas emerge, and some of this knowledge, if you like, emerged from the NACAC, the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council experience. But it's an institution in serious trouble. The Madlanga Commission, should have been put in place the day Zuma left office, because one has to remember that these institutions, these criminal justice institutions, were Zuma's first and prime targets for capture, and they've never really recovered from that. Actually, certainly never fully recovered. I think they're a hell of a lot better now than they were 8 or 9 years ago, 8 years ago, but they haven't fully recovered. There's no question about it.
And David, in your view, and I know we're digressing a little bit from the NPA, but obviously the Madlanga inquiry, in the limited time that it's been up and running, seems to have uncovered very serious issues of systematic corruption within the most senior levels of the South African police services. I mean, I personally had always been worried about corruption within the SAPS, but the extent of this and what's been emerging out of the Madlanga inquiry recently is mind-blowing, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. Particularly within the higher upper echelons of the South African police service. And what is the solution to this? I mean, does there have to be a clean out of a large portion of the higher echelons of the South African police service?
Yeah, you're dealing with an organization of 200,000 people and a budget of about 120 billion rand a year. I think even if this was a reasonably well-functioning private sector institution, turning it around would be a real challenge, and it truly is difficult to know where to begin. We've made a number of proposals in the NACAC report about how to deal with SAPS. I mean, one of it is to look again at the mandates given to, for example, the Hawks, which is completely ridiculous. They could never meet their mandate. And the upshot is that they've focused on elements of organized crime like cash and transit heists, and they've done reasonably well at it. But there's been very little focus on corruption. Because corruption is really difficult to prosecute. If I was a prosecutor wanting a good record in prosecution, the last thing I would choose is a big corruption case, because they anywhere in the world, they're extremely difficult to prosecute, and we'll come round to talking about that, I'm sure, but people do forget that. I think the one issue that needs to be traversed is precisely the officer corps of SAPS. I mean, firstly, it's much too large. I had never met anything other than a constable before we started this work. I now only know generals in SAPS, and I must know 100 of them at least, and I think there are another 140 or so that I haven't yet met. So it's much too big, and there is a lot of corruption and a lot of mistrust, and nobody trusts each other in the SAPS leadership, and you can see it, from what I think is started off as a jockeying for position between two of the principal members of the drama, but I think what they should be doing is they should be requiring that all police officers above the rank of brigadier should reapply for their jobs. And if they pass muster, they're placed in their jobs. If they don't, they should be removed. And even if this involves a large payout to the people who are removed, it will be cheaper than keeping an utterly dysfunctional SAPS going. We were advised, by a serious policy advice from some retired police generals that crime intelligence should be disbanded, and crime intelligence is absolutely essential in the prosecution of corruption and organized crime. It's an absolutely corrupted institution, and apparently also incompetent, although they're quite competent at having destroyed the institution. But they seriously said, close it down and start again. I mean, what we've proposed instead is that the principal organizations dealing with corruption in our proposal, as with the Hawks and IDAC, should be given their own intelligence capacities, and maybe even the SAPS unit that is responsible for investigating lesser forms of corruption should be given its own intelligence unit. They should be devolved. Crime intelligence should be devolved to the units that are actually using the intelligence or meant to use the intelligence. But these are all changes that are going to be heavily resisted. And we're going to need a very determined president and very determined minister, both of whom I think we've got actually, to pull off something like the kind of changes that are needed to reform SAPS, because it's truly a difficult institution. I mean, they must. I hope that somebody is thinking, I don't know if this is the right answer, about the question of devolution. Maybe the organization is too big to turn around. Maybe it should be devolved to the provinces, which has been a DA proposal with respect to the Western Cape. And I'm not sure if it has been a point scoring proposal, a political point scoring proposal, or a serious proposal, but it's one that definitely needs to be seriously looked into.
David, on the subject of institutional reform, I mean, obviously the NPA, I think, is probably in much better shape than SAPS, but there still have been, I think, quite serious question marks over issues like financial independence and the appointments to senior positions within the NPA. And certainly my understanding is that the Director General of Justice essentially controls the purse strings of the NPA and is the accounting officer, and the President controls all the senior appointments into the NPA. What are your thoughts about sort of institutional reform insofar as sort of financial independence and those sort of issues are concerned?
Yeah, there's a really anomalous situation with respect to the NPA. It does not have institutional independence. And in fact, I'm sure its institutional independence doesn't match the requirements of I think it was, I always forget the name of the Glenister case, the Glenister judgments. It sounds rather technical and trivial, but the NPA does not have its own accounting officer. The accounting officer is in the Department of Justice, which means that they don't control their budget. And the upshot of that is that they don't control the allocation of their budget, obviously. So if they wanted to employ a really skilled forensic person, they not only have to get that post approved by the Department of Justice and advertised by the Department of Justice, and the salary has to be decided by the Department of Justice, giving the NPA as a skills-intensive organization and prosecution as an extremely skills-intensive activity. No control over who it hires, what it decides it needs to pay in order to hire them, how to issue the advert, whether in fact the decision over whether they need somebody or not rests with the Department of Justice. And given the extent of turf wars always in the public sector, and I'm sure in the private sector as well, it's not good to have your money and your human resource decisions particularly, but also your decisions about how much you spend on a particular case, whatever the matter might be, decided by someone who does not have the expertise and the knowledge and the proximity to make those decisions. So this is something which apparently is in the pipeline. This is a proposal that we're not by any means the first to have made, and it would be very easily changed. And I think it needs to be changed, and it needs to be changed quickly. And it would not be difficult to change, and I doubt that there would be any opposition to a change. And then the appointments process is a big deal as well, but also one that would be very easy to change. If there's any unanimity that came out of the various competition inquiries and the pundits and the researchers and the public, it was that Zuma's power over appointments, over critical appointments, including the head of the NPA, the head of SARS, the Commissioner of Police, are all made unilaterally by the president, or can be made unilaterally by the president. And Zuma exploited this to the fullest extent possible. You put the wrong people in the right jobs, as it were, and you get what we have gotten, particularly from the Hawks and the NPA and SAPS, and for a while SARS. And so this has got to be changed. And there was complete unanimity from the Chief Justice down to the lowliest citizen that these appointment procedures need to be changed. President Ramaphosa, in appointing the NPA, has given more than appointing the NDPP, the head of the NPA, has shown that he too accepts that, because despite his ability to make this decision unilaterally, he did set up a selection committee. And that's all that's all you need to do. I mean, I didn't agree with the composition of the selection committee to appoint the NPA. I think that what you need on those kind of committees are people who are experienced in human resources. You obviously need some police knowledge and police experience that could be from in the country or from out of the country, but you need people who know how to interview other people and how to look for inconsistencies. And if we have any expertise in this country, it's in human resource management, for good reason. And you need to place some really high-powered human resource managers on this kind of committee, and you need this decision to be made on merit only. And the president has I think he's done that in the case of the appointment of Batoy's successor, but it needs to be enshrined in legislation. And there are a number of other appointments like that. In SAPS, in fact, that problem goes much further down the employment ladder than the NDPP. It also applies to the heads of the provincial directorates of SAPS, who are very important figures. In fact, it's one thing you didn't mention, Anthony, in the stuff that needs to be changed, is that contrary to popular opinion or expectation, the NDP, the head of the NPA, does not have decision-making power over when to prosecute, when to withdraw prosecution, when to continue with the prosecution, what the prosecutorial strategy would be. The provincial directors have that power. And that's also a real anomaly. I think it originates from the old apartheid system of provincial attorneys general, and somehow or another that system was effectively kept in place, although we are no longer a provincialized prosecutorial authority. And that needs to change immediately. I mean, can you imagine being the CEO of a company that doesn't have control over the major decisions and strategies and that the organization makes? So these are not rocket science, and nor are they difficult to implement. Uh, and I don't know why we drag our heels about something like like that, for example. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction the appointment of Andy Matibi. I really celebrated when Andy was appointed head of the NPA. I think for a lot of reasons, which we can go into later. I think he's got some of the right approach to head the NPA, but he's only got 2 years, as you pointed out, in office. Well, can't that be changed? I'm sure you'd tell me it can't apply retrospectively or something, but but surely they should be working now on a change to change the retirement age. I mean, I've often thought, stevedores should be forced to retire at the age of 55. Lawyers are not lifting logs exactly. Some of our greatest lawyers are in their late 70s or early 80s. It's nonsense to have a compulsory retirement age of 65. This is a bit of a bee in my bonnet. I have several friends who are university professors that are twiddling their thumbs at the age of, 67, when they could be uh, doing wonderful teaching to new historians or whatever the case may be. And the same applies to the NPA. And they should change that now, not in 1 year and 363 days time, but now. And they should deal with whatever problems it gives rise to now, so that he can serve a 10-year term. And believe you me, if you knew Andy's energy, you would know that this is well within his capability to serve out until he's in his early 70s or something. So there are a lot of changes that need to be done. And the frustrating thing about it is, to turn SAPS around is a gigantic job. To amend particular pieces of legislation to make the turnaround in some of the other criminal justice systems and SAPS is not that difficult. And they should be made with urgency, just like we should have had the Madlanga Commission in office the day Zuma was shown the door. We should have had a Madlanga, because the SAPS has been in crisis for forever, and it needs to be addressed really urgently, and all these reforms need to be addressed really urgently. And the ones that frustrate me the most are those simple ones which somehow prevent you from getting to the real underlying problems.
And David, on that score, I mean, I think we're absolutely agreed that Andy Matibi is a great guy to be taking over from Shamila. He's had a very good track record at the SIU, and certainly in our day-to-day experience, the SIU has been an organization that actually functions reasonably effectively. And of all of the ones that we've been discussing this morning, the SIU, certainly in our day-to-day experience, has been in a reasonably effective organization. But is he going to be severely hamstrung in his job? And the reason I say that is I think there are currently quite a few vacancies in the deputy directors of public prosecutions. The head of the asset forfeiture has retired, Omar Rasataba. Anton Duplessis has left the NPA. So there are some significant vacancies in the deputy director portfolio. And I think those can only be filled by the president appointing new people into those posts. And they've, I think, currently got some acting people at the moment. But there does seem to me, as you've mentioned, some urgency in having to correct these things, because otherwise the person who takes over essentially really has their hands tied. They don't have any additional effective assistance at the deputy director level, their ability, as you've mentioned, to control the decisions of the provincial heads of the NPA is completely hamstrung. And they inherit an organization which is, I think to some extent short of skills, short on morale, and it's a hard organization to turn around unless there is some real urgency from government to make the kinds of changes that we've been discussing, so that whoever takes over, doesn't essentially become a bit of a damp squib in their ability to transform the organization. And I just wanted to get your thoughts around that.
I think that government, at least in the important positions with respect to these issues, have kind of gotten the message. And I think that applies to the president. It applies to the Minister of Police, the acting Minister of Police. It applies to the Minister of Justice as well, I think. And I think that there is a certain amount of urgency and good faith in their wish to do this. So I have no doubt. I mean, the president obviously has a lot of respect for Andy Mothibi. I mean, after all, he was appointed, and he wasn't even on the shortlist. I don't think he even applied initially. The selection committee in this instance could not find one of the candidates who had applied and who was on the shortlist would be fit to run the NPA. So he must trust Andy, and I trust that will reflect, once again in the appointment of selection committees for these key posts in the NPA, and that when the president makes his decision, because I think that decision should still lie with the president on recommendation of a process that I'm sure most of us had to go through in order to get our jobs, like standing before a selection committee and, explaining why you're the right candidate for the job. And I'm sure that the president will do that. And, I would like to think he will listen to the advice that he gets from his NDPP. So, I'm sure that will be done, but these things need to change. I mean, Andy is going to face problems. He's going to face far fewer problems than Shamila Batoy faced when she took over, but he is going to face problems. One thing, there are many things about Andy that appeal to me. He's got energy. He's got a kind of can-do attitude towards things. But the thing I like most, which you may or may not be surprised to hear, is that he has a very good sense of how to communicate publicly. And I know that this is constrained in the case of an organization like the NPA. I mean, a lot of what they deal with has to be kept confidential, but there's a lot that can be shared with the public. And my own humble experience in dealing with, through most of my career with controversial and sort of intellectually complex issues like competition law, for example, is that you have to have the public on side. You have to explain to them what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. Because I think, one of the things that must have hamstrung, and it must be hamstringing, if that's the right word, the morale in the NPA is the ridiculous criticism to which they're subject to from the profession, who should know better, from the public, who shouldn't be expected to know better in this instance. But it is bloody difficult to prosecute. I know, and Anthony knows, how difficult it is to prosecute a secret conspiracy on a balance of probabilities, never mind on a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. And the public need to appreciate that, not as an excuse, but as a way of explaining to them why it takes a year to file or 2 years to file papers, why we allow the kind of technical objections that we allow, which may seem technical but are really about often they often are just technical, but I mean sometimes they're about our rights and due process and those sorts of good things as well. But somebody at the head of the NPA needs to be explaining this to the public. I'm amazed to see they also need to be explaining it to the profession, and they also need to be explaining it to pundits as well. But in no country in the world is prosecution a sufficient deterrence against corruption. The US may have been the exception in this regard, but we know the kind of resources that are poured into US law enforcement. And we know the history of US law enforcement, where, even though the Attorney General is a member of the cabinet, a member of the executive, the history of independence has been incredibly powerful in this area of US administration. And we have seen how quickly that could be destroyed. So, we've got to take a view on those kind of things, and somebody needs to educate the public about that and to have some sort of empathy for what they do. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of the things that they do have not been shown up as incompetent, um, and that needs to be dealt with as well. But unlike the United States, we have a president who I don't think would ever interfere in a prosecutorial decision, and we should thank God for that, and we should take advantage of that, because this wasn't the case with the last president, and who knows what it will be with the next president. So you've got to, in the 250 years it took the US to imbue this respect for independence, you've now got 2 years to do that in South Africa. And Andy has the energy and the nous and the charm and just good guy image to be able to pull off something like being the public face of the NPA, which is a difficult task because, as I've said, there are constraints on how much he can speak about. But don't underestimate the importance of public communications in this regard. And he's a very effective communicator. That's one of the reasons you think that the SIU is such an effective institution. Not because he's bullshitting, but because he's just good at doing this kind of thing.
David, can I ask one last question of you? And then I've been hogging the conversation, so I'm going to hand over to Michelle shortly. But just on this issue of capabilities and competence, and I'd be the first to agree with you to say that I think the NPA has an extraordinarily difficult job. And we all know, and you and I know better than most, that even in a competition law context, trying to prove cartel cases is hard enough. And that's on a much lower standard of proof, etc. So the NPA has got a very difficult job, and for the reasons we've discussed this morning, are resource constrained, are constrained by the legislation, and all of those sorts of things, which I think certainly I readily accept. But I think that there is an issue which goes a little broader, which I think Andy Matibi is going to have to tackle, which is competence and approach within the organization. And I just want to sort of talk a little bit about our recent personal experience as a firm, because we've recently dealt with some very high profile, I would call them financial crime matters, particularly ones involving fraud, etc. And we've also recently, Michelle and I have dealt with some very other serious criminal matters on behalf of some of our corporate clients. And I think, unfortunately, our recent experience has not been a good one. And when I say it's not been a good one, I think it is because the prosecutors certainly that we have engaged with have really not shown any real interest in prosecuting some of these matters, despite the fact that in some of these cases, the private sector organizations have provided them with these cases on a plate. To be perfectly honest, the private sector organizations have done a lot of the hard yards in helping to assist the prosecution with these matters. And despite the obvious failings of the police services in investigating these cases properly, have really sought to assist the prosecution in taking these matters forward. And despite that, there has been very little concerted action by the NPA to prosecute these matters. And I'd just be interested in your view about how someone new like Andy Matibi coming into the organization, how does he change the dynamics of this? You know, how does he really make sure that the prosecutors on the ground do their jobs properly? And you know, I'm absolutely mindful of the issues that you've raised about the difficulties that they have, and I agree with that entirely. But certainly our day-to-day experience recently on some of these cases has been that there has been a total lack of interest, a total lack of application, and frankly, a complete skills deficit in actually dealing with these matters. And this is a really serious problem, because I think, you know, if the corporate community starts to believe that, you know, serious fraud, serious corruption doesn't get prosecuted, that there's no real interest from the NPA in pursuing these matters, you know, that starts to send a signal, unfortunately, and I think it's a signal we can't afford. So I'd just be interested in your views on that.
Yeah, you know, he has to approach it with care. I mean, one of the obvious possible solutions of this is to get the private bar to prosecute or to assist in the prosecution of matters. And you know, there's been a whole hoo-ha about that, and I think they don't understand that the private bar will provide the best attack or the best defense that they're paid to provide, and they'll do that for the state as eagerly as they do it for a private client. You know, if they paid a reasonable sum, which may not be their usual daily rate, but for the fame that you get from this, they could discount it a bit. But I think that would be one of the obvious solutions, and then to look at the salary differentials. You know, both for forensic investigators and for senior lawyers. I mean, the salary differential is vast, and it will never be a lot less than vast, but it could be made somewhat less than vast. And that goes to the question of allowing the NPA to decide the salary levels in the organization and who gets employed in the organization. So I don't buy the stuff about just because they come from the private sector, they can't be trusted to prosecute for the public sector. But the question of morale comes into place. I mean, you know, how would you feel if every sexy case that came and you were a prosecutor got, you know, somebody else got brought in to prosecute it? You would feel bad about your own the judgment of your own competence, and you would feel that you were missing the action. Well, there are ways of dealing with that. You know, there are mentoring ways, there are training schools. You know, that both of them have actually quite good introductory programs, both the Hawks and the NPA, and the best people are poached within days of getting out of their introductory parts of their employment. I mean, General Abia once said to me that they had increased their establishment had been at 50% of what they were entitled to. They eventually, with much effort, increased it to something like 80, 90%. And within weeks, they were back to 50% again. And so you've got to think of salary levels, you've got to think of employment satisfaction. In the US, it's always been striking, and I'm sure it must have been to Anthony in the competition work as well. You go and work at the US Department of Justice's antitrust division, and you emerge with a reputation that will have Wall Street firms falling over themselves to employ you because they know the quality of that department, or at least what used to be the quality of that department. And that's the situation you want to get into with a public body. You want private sector employers to say, this is a good thing to see on somebody's CV, and then people will come to work for the public sector. But we're very far away from that, and we need to get to that position. But in the meantime, I think, attract some of our great criminal bar defenders and get them into the prosecutorial service. It would be interesting to see what they do there and how difficult they find it. And just one last thing, because I want to hear from Michelle, is that the courts have to be looked at as well. I mean, this is something I could go on about for hours, but they are much too permissive. And I say this as a non-lawyer. They are much too permissive in allowing reviews and technical points and all of the kind of thing that they allow. Look at the Zuma trial. I mean, any child knows that this is not real law that is being practiced there. It's just a way of delaying, and I've seen it in the competition authorities as well. And what are the courts doing? Why are they so permissive about these things? It's not all due process, and it's not all natural justice and all of those things. Sometimes it's just, I don't know what it is. It's just, frankly, laziness. It's easier to dismiss something on some technical point or another, like this ridiculous Gayton McKenzie ruling recently, for example. But the courts need to be told, we need justice to be done and adopt a stricter standard towards what are palpably simply delaying tactics. So anyway, that's my tuppence worth on the judges, which I could have a lot more worth in that, but it needs to change.
Michelle, I've hogged the conversation. Over to you.
No problem. I see you've left me all of 15 minutes. David, I wanted to talk a little bit about the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council report, which was issued issued to the president in August last year. And that was the culmination of 3 years of work, which you were integrally involved in, into the analysis of the legislative and systemic weaknesses that basically enabled corruption. And that report makes obviously a lot of recommendations, but I just wanted to talk about a couple of them. And the main one, from my understanding, is the establishment of the Office of Public Integrity and Anti-Corruption, or the OPI, which I think is the key recommendation that comes out of that report. And my understanding is the intention is that it will be a Chapter 9 institution, that it will be a permanent, independent, overarching anti-corruption body. And in the report, it says that this type of body is way overdue, which I think it is. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about exactly what is envisaged and what is the idea around creating a new institution. What's the intention? What is it? What is the plan for that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Yeah, the Office of Public Integrity, the OPI, another acronym for your alphabet soup. But we knew and we sympathized with what was going to be a criticism about yet another institution to fail, and we sought to avoid that by recommending that it be merged with the SIU. So there's not a net new institution there, but the powers and the functions and the statutory basis, or the SIU needs to change significantly. So there's some big changes to be introduced. There are new powers to be introduced. There are new personnel to be introduced, new skills to be introduced. But we did this largely for reasons of economy, of both time and money. You can't imagine how long it takes to pass major legislation. At the moment, on average, about 4 years, 5 years, and then to set up a new institution takes another 4 or 5 years, and we can't wait that long. So we recommended that it merge with the SIU, which was in any event doing a lot of the work that we were suggesting that that the OPI does. And the work that we are suggesting that the OPI focus on is prevention. Now, there's going to be a lot of skepticism about whether you can prevent corruption, but you can, and there are ways of doing it, and I'll go into some of that. So, and we are suggesting prevention for, what I said earlier to Andy, in no part of the world is the risk-return ratio on engaging in corruption more favorable to corruption than any other crime. I mean, the returns from corruption are just so great that anybody in just about any country in the world must calculate that if I'm careful and if I'm clever, the chances of being successfully prosecuted are small. So because of that, and without ignoring the importance of prosecution and criminal law, we have proposed that this body focus on prevention. And this is not all so-called soft stuff. I mean, for example, when you see what happens in an organization like the Department of Health in Gauteng, or the lottery, or any of these other, or PRASA, or any of these other iconic corruption cases, you have to know that these are just not a coincidental grouping together of bad guys. There is something wrong with the entire institution. What is wrong with the Gauteng Department of Health or with Tembisa Hospital that allowed them to employ all these bad people in very powerful positions and take these bad decisions? Well, it's about governance. Largely, I think our problems are largely about poor governance. But that's what it's about. And so, we and I'm sure we're going to, the poor people who take over this are going to spend a lot of time in court, but we want, for example, the right to on certain legal tests, obviously, the right to conduct an investigation of what we call systemic corruption. Go into the Department of Health using management consultants, using forensic investigators, using experts in public administration, and see what is wrong with this body. I mean, what might be wrong, and I think what was certainly wrong in Tembisa Hospital, is the way in which people were appointed. To tighten up that process, and half of these people wouldn't have gotten through the first round of a selection committee. And there are other systemic investigations that be conducted, like, for example, gathering data together in one place, making a whole lot of data systems speak to each other of government. So Home Affairs speaks to criminal justice, speaks to motor licensing, or whatever the case may be, and have somebody that brings all this data together that the police can easily access when they investigate cases. And there are a number of other suggestions, and public communication is one of them. I'm really in favor of a very big public education program about corruption, which is controversial because it's worked some places and it hasn't worked other places. But if they gave me a few $100 million and let me mount a public education process, I'm telling you, we would turn this. We would start to turn this around. I'm sorry, I won't take more of your time, but I was telling Michelle that the logo, which you see, Anthony's the wrong way around and Michelle's the right way around. with the steam coming out of a cup of coffee is what the Hong Kong Anti-Corruption Authority, which has been very, very successful, uses as its logo. And this is plastered all over town, and in public meetings, you don't see pictures of the president, you see the coffee cup. And the coffee cup means that if you called in by the Anti-Corruption Authority to have a cup of coffee, you know that you're in serious trouble. And it says somebody is watching you. Now, can you imagine if you had the SIU Cobra, the striking Cobra, plastered all over every street pole in Johannesburg? Obviously, they've got to believe that the Cobra will bite. But we need public education and public communication around corruption badly. And so what we are proposing, that the key take home is merge with the SIU and engage in prevention. And under Andy's leadership, they did do a lot of this, even though some argue that it might have exceeded his mandate a little bit or whatever. But you can put that into his mandate. You could empower the SIU in the relatively short term to do many of these things while we're waiting for the legislation around the OPI to come into force, and to make their recommendations around systemic changes that need to be introduced binding. Those are the kind of reforms that we need for the OPI to be effective, and I think it could be a very effective body.
And just to that point, am I correct that the intention is that the OPI would be able to investigate off its own bat, unlike the SIU, where the SIU must wait for a presidential proclamation before they can investigate?
Oh yeah, no, that absolutely has to be changed. I mean, what we've recommended is that the president still be empowered to order an investigation, but that again, on a certain legal test, that the OPI will have the right to initiate their own investigations. Absolutely, that's a critical factor in its independence.
Okay. David, we've got 5 minutes left, and there was one other issue which I think is very topical and which I noticed permeates the report, and that is this issue of whistleblower protection and the safety and security of law enforcement personnel and witnesses. I think one of the biggest issues is that without people coming forward when they see corruption, without people willing to give evidence, without investigators willing to investigate or prosecutors to prosecute, it seems to me that we will get nowhere in the fight against corruption. And doing some research, I was just looking at some of the frightening stats on the number of insolvency practitioners and tax consultants and other professionals, prosecutors, who have been assassinated in recent years due to their involvement in investigating or prosecuting corruption. I found an interesting article yesterday about where the business development director of a vehicle armor plating company was interviewed, and he said their demand has increased or increases 30 to 50% year on year. And he specifically mentioned judges are being threatened, people are scared. And I think if this issue isn't resolved, we risk paralysis of the entire system. The new whistleblower protection bill can't come soon enough, and I think there's been a lot of talk about it in the last couple of years, and was mentioned again by the president this week. But it's also something that was, I think, very close to your heart when you were still with Corruption Watch, and that they advocated very strongly for. But I just wanted to, as a final question, get some of your thoughts on how this can be addressed.
Yeah, with difficulty. I tell you, whistleblowing working for these kind of, or against these kind of people is never going to be without danger and without hazard. The stakes are, just because the stakes are so high. And I don't know, you can put more people, you can open witness protection to more people, you can strengthen witness protection. But the fact of the matter is that witness protection is not an attractive way of life, to put it mildly. And it goes to the weakness of SAPS. I mean, I cannot for the life of me understand, for example, how nobody has been charged for Babita Diakaram's murder. They know who benefited from the murder. These must have been the people who had some role in ordering the murder. I'm not proposing torture, but maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea. But get the information out of them. There's some cases that seem reasonably clear-cut that are not protected, and you've got to wonder whether the police care or don't care, or whether the police are not complicit in this kind of in these kind of hits. So, I think, we've proposed that people be rewarded for giving information, difficult, complicated issue. But again, it also goes to the question of education, plea bargaining. The public don't like plea bargains. And I kind of understand why they don't, but you can tell them that we haven't got sufficient evidence, we think. Well, maybe that's a bad example, actually, to introduce in the circumstance. But yes, I think we need better protection. I don't see how you can't, post a police guard around every commercial law practice in town. You could place a police guard on critical whistleblowers, or put them in witness protection. But there will always be an element of public service in blowing the whistle. There will always be an element of integrity that is needed to blow the whistle. And I don't think, the approach we adopted in Corruption Watch was never to tell people, listen, we can protect you. We could get a security company. We could get this. We could get the other thing. It was always to say to them, look, in the end, this is a difficult road that you're choosing. And are you prepared for the difficulties that follow? But boy, you are doing a really great job. I would, these sound like silly things, but if I were handing out national honors, I wouldn't be giving it to fly-halves and fast bowlers and whatever. I would give it to whistleblowers. These are the people who should be celebrated. I mean, the president should give some indication that if you touch these people, it would be like touching a member of my cabinet. Only it would be more. If we would lose more. You've got to celebrate whistleblowers. They've got to be made to feel like heroes and people who've really contributed to the society, and they have to be better protected, and their loss of income has to be compensated for in some way or another. But I've noticed, even with the private sector, somebody gets a reputation as a whistleblower. And it happened a lot in the Trillion case, for example. Somebody gets a reputation as a whistleblower. That carries with them the reputation of these people are troublemakers. And even firms that would never engage in corruption will say, do we really want somebody in our firm who ratted on her own CEO? No, we don't, because you never know what will happen in the future. And these kind of attitudes have to change. I mean, these people have to be sought after for new employment, not shunned because they feel like trouble. So it's always going to be a difficult issue. It's never going to be one that's, unless you offer large amounts of money, which they did in the United States, or do in the United States, and then you have queues around the block of the Federal Trade Commission with people lining up to provide so-called evidence, which they won't get until there's been a successful prosecution. So they might be dead before they get the evidence, but before they get the reward. But that's the kind of thing that you've got to do, I think.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting, and I think, yeah, thank you for your thoughts, and I'll leave it to Anthony to wrap up because we're a little bit over time.
David, thank you very, very much for joining us on the first of our briefs. I think it was a great discussion. We could probably have had an additional hour with you to canvass all of these topics, but I think it's reassuring to hear you say that you think Andy Matibi is a good person to be taking over the mantle at the NPA, and I think that's a good thing to hear. I think, as we've discussed this morning, there are some big institutional challenges, and I think some very urgent legislative changes that need to come in to secure the NPA's financial independence, to make sure that the head of the NPA is not hamstrung in his ability to run the organization. And I think those changes are imperative if there's going to be any meaningful difference on the ground. But at least I think what's come out of this morning's discussion is at least there's a good person who's taking the reins at the NPA. Hopefully, with the assistance of government and the private sector, he will be able to make a difference. And I guess it's watch this space. And thank you to people like you who've put in huge amounts of energy to try and transform our criminal justice system. And you know, personally, I'd want to thank you for everything you've done at Corruption Watch, what you continue to do, and we need more people like you. And thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Michelle. I think these kind of public engagements, quasi-public engagements, are really important, and I look forward to being an honorary invitee to your future ones. You should get, if you want to last bit of advice, get a really good criminal defendant to come and speak to people about what they think about these things. I'd be fascinated to hear if they think their job is going to get any more difficult. Probably, I would like to think that they will. But thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone who joined us this morning. And we look forward to the next one. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks,
bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.